Hi, welcome to Dreamsical Designs by Danielle. In this video, I show you how to design and sew your very own denim coat with a border fabric. This includes the outer coats, inner facings, linings, welt pockets, outer pockets, and a belt. Instead of starting the pattern making process from scratch, I give you the skills to create your own designs by transforming a single pattern, your basic blocks, the foundation to all your designs. So we start with your basic bodice blocks, and I show you how to transform them into this coat. If you don't yet have basic bodice blocks, I've got you covered. Watch my other videos on how to draft those. Once you drafted your coat pattern pieces, I show you step by step how to sew the entire coat from scratch. While I show you how to work with border print fabric in this video, this design does lend itself well to other medium to heavyweight woven fabrics and colors. Let's get started. These are the tools that you will need for the pattern making process. Regular large sheets of paper. I'm using poster board that is 22 inches by 28 inches. A large rectangular ruler. Mine is 24 inches by 6 inches. A flexible ruler. A tape measure. Mine has both inches and centimeters on it. A hip curve ruler. A French curve ruler. A pencil and eraser. Start with your front basic bodice block, non-stretch edition. If you don't have one, watch my tutorial video linked in the description. I'm using clear acetate paper to show transformations to the basic blocks, but you should work directly on a copy of your basic blocks using a pencil and eraser. Determine your desired coat length. I put mine a little below my knee. Mark this location. Measure 1 inch below this mark, and this will be the new hemline. This extra 1 inch will fold under to the inside of the coat, making sure that your lining doesn't show on the outside. Extend the shoulder line by 1/2 inch. Extend the hip line by 1/2 inch. Extend the armhole by 1/2 inch outwards from the base. We will not use any darts in this pattern piece since we want the coat to be a loose fit. So if you have a chest dart, you will need to lower the front side seam by the width of the dart and redraw the armhole accordingly. Then draw a vertical line from the new armhole base to the hip line and a vertical line from the hip line to the hemline. Then smooth out the lines intersecting at the hip line. Extend the center line by 2 inch inwards. Then connect the new center line to the neckline and hem with a horizontal line. This is the final front coat pattern piece. You will need to cut 2 as a mirror image from your main coat fabric. We're going to use the coat front pattern that we just drafted as our foundation for the transformation into the front facing and front lining. Shorten the hemline by 2 inches. On your shoulder line, mark 2.5 inches inwards from the neckline. On your chest line, waistline, and hemline, mark 4.5 inches inwards from the center line. Using your flexible ruler, connect the 4 markings that you just made. To the right of these markings, which I'm using red marker to shade in, represents your front facing. To the left of these markings, which I'm using blue marker to shade in, represents your front lining. You will need to draw these out on separate sheets of paper and add in the seam allowance along that dividing line you drew earlier. This is the final coat front facing pattern piece. You will need to cut 2 as a mirror image from your main coat fabric and 2 as a mirror image from your interfacing. And this is the final front lining pattern piece. You will need to cut 2 as a mirror image from your lining fabric. Start with your back basic bodice block, non-stretch edition. Make the same modifications that you did for the coat front, with the exception of extending the center line and lowering the armhole. Drew the side seams of the front and back patterns to make sure that they are the same length. Then draw in your seam allowances. This is a final coat back pattern piece. You will need to cut 1 on the fold from your main coat fabric. We're going to use the coat back pattern that we just drafted as our foundation for the transformation into the back facing and back lining. Shorten the hemline by 2 inches. On your shoulder line, mark 2.5 inches inwards from the neckline. This matches the shoulder marking that you made earlier on your coat front pattern. On your back center line, mark 3 inches below your neckline. Using your flexible ruler, connect the two markings, making sure to flatten the line out at the center line so that it can smoothly connect with its other half. Above these markings, which I'm using red marker to shade in, represents your back facing. Below these markings, which I'm using blue marker to shade in, represent your back lining. There is an additional modification you need to make to the lining to ensure there is enough room for movement. Extend the lining center line by 1 inch inwards. You will need to draw the back facing and lining out on separate sheets of paper and add in the seam allowance along that dividing curve you drew earlier. This is the final coat back facing pattern piece. You will need to cut one from your main coat fabric and cut one from your interfacing. And this is the final back lining pattern piece. You will need to cut one on the fold from your lining fabric. Start with your basic sleeve block, non-stretch edition. If you don't have one, watch my tutorial video linked in the description. Extend the armhole on both the front and back sleeve bicep line to match the length of the armholes on your bodice. Use a flexible curve ruler to redraw the armhole curve if an extension greater than ½ inch is needed, such as for your front armhole. Rebalance the sleeve center line, which should go through the midpoint of the bicep line. Extend the wrist line width by 1 inch. Extend the length of the sleeve past your wrist by 1 inch, which will be the new hem line. This extra 1 inch will fold under to the inside of the sleeve, making sure that your lining doesn't show on the outside. Use your rectangle ruler to connect the new armhole bases to the wrist line. Then redraw your seam allowances. This is the final coat sleeve pattern piece. You will need to cut 2 as a mirror image from your main coat fabric. Next, we're going to use this coat sleeve pattern as our foundation for the transformation into the sleeve lining. The only difference with the sleeve lining is the length. It is 2 inches shorter than the coat sleeve pattern. This is the final sleeve lining pattern piece. You will need to cut 2 as a mirror image from your lining fabric. The outer pockets are a rectangle that are 6.25 inches wide by 7.25 inches tall with a 0.5 inch seam allowance. The pocket is big enough to fit your hand and a phone. You're welcome to modify the dimensions as you like. You will need to cut 4 as mirror images from your fabric. The inner welt pockets are a rectangle that are 6 inches wide by 8.25 inches tall with a 0.5 inch seam allowance and a fold line at the bottom. The pocket is big enough to fit your phone and a slim wallet. You're welcome to modify the dimensions as you like. The smaller welt pocket is 4.5 inches wide by 4.5 inches tall with a ½ inch seam allowance. The pocket is big enough to fit your credit cards, cash, and driver's license. You will need to cut 2 on the fold from your lining fabric. And that's it. We're done our designing. You should have 11 pattern pieces in total. I highly recommend making a prototype to confirm the fit of your design. This is my denim fabric with an embroidered border print. You could use a different medium to heavyweight woven fabric for your coat if you like. This is my lining fabric. I chose to use a lightweight purple polyester fabric to pair with the coloring of the embroidery. This is my sewn interfacing cotton fabric. I'm using leftover cotton fabric from another project. The interfacing will provide structure to the facings. Lastly, you will need 4 6 inches long invisible zippers and at least 1 button. I chose to use 1 button for my coat, which is 1.25 inches, but you're welcome to use more on yours. Even though all of your seams will be hidden on the inside, it's good practice to still overcast, serge, or zigzag stitch the raw seam edges to help your garment last longer. I'm using an overcast foot on my sewing machine to protect the raw edges. We will start with the interfacing. Line up the interfacing pieces with their corresponding main fabric facing pieces and clip in place. Using a denim needle to sew denim fabric, take the interfacing pieces and sew within the seam allowance and around the perimeter of each piece to act as an underlining. Before we sew the coat lining pieces together, we need to sew the welt pockets. Take a small strip of fusible interfacing and attach that over the welt opening of both pockets. Place the welt pocket right sides together with your front coat lining piece, pin around the welt opening. I placed my smaller welt pocket above the waistline and my larger welt pocket below the waistline. On your sewing machine, sew along the perimeter of the welt opening. You may need to reduce your stitch length to ensure that your needle ends exactly at the welt opening corners. This is what your sewn welt opening should look like after you're done. Now we need to cut into the center of the welt pocket opening. When you get to about 0.25 inches from the end, cut towards the corners of the welt pocket to form a triangle flap. Make sure not to cut past your stitches or into your stitches. Repeat this process for the other welt pockets. Next, turn your welt pocket to the inside and press everything flat. This includes pressing a folded portion of the bottom of the welt pocket up to cover the welt pocket opening. To hold the fabric around the welt pocket opening in place, you should sew across the two triangle flaps at the side and the seam at the bottom. Try to sew as close as possible along the inside edge of the triangle flaps on both sides of the welt pocket opening and as close as possible to the edge of the seam at the bottom. These stitches will help hold things in place and prevent shifting during pocket usage. We're ready to attach the invisible zippers. Line up the zipper on the back side of the welt pocket opening. Make sure the zipper pull is flush with one side and that the zipper teeth sit in the center of the welt opening. Pin the zipper in place from the right side of the fabric because this is the side that we're going to sew from. Change your regular sewing foot to a zipper foot. This will allow you to get a closer stitch. Sew around the perimeter of the welt opening. Maneuver the zipper pull out of the way as you're sewing. Repeat this process for the other welt pockets. When you're done, this is what your top stitching should look like. After you've pressed the welt pocket opening flat, use pinking shears to trim both ends of the zipper down. You can now close up your pocket, fold the pocket up, and clip in place. Sew the three sides of the pocket closed, starting from one end to the other. Be sure to maneuver the front lining out of the way so you don't accidentally stitch the pocket to the lining. And that was the last step for your welt pockets that are now complete. On your back lining, create the 1-inch pleat in the center back at the top and bottom, lining up your notches from your pattern and clip in place. Place your front and back lining pieces right sides together and clip the shoulder and side seams in place. On your sewing machine, sew the shoulder seams, side seams, and center back pleat in place. Moving on to the sleeves. Take your sleeve linings and fold them lengthwise, right sides together to line up the side seams, then clip in place. Sew a straight stitch down the side seams of the sleeve linings. To prep the sleeve armholes for sewing, place 2 rows of basting stitches of length 5 in between the armhole notches on both sleeves and within the seam allowance. When you get to the second row of basting stitches, increase your tension to a 6 or higher to auto-gather the fabric. Place the sleeve lining armhole and coat lining armhole right sides together, lining up the side seam, shoulder seams, and notches. You will need to finesse the gathered fabric to ensure even distribution, then clip or pin in place. I like to hand sew a basting stitch to hold the armhole in place before sewing it. Sew around the circumference of the armhole on both sleeves. Once complete, you can remove your basting stitches and press the seams open. This is what your finished sleeve should look like. Place your back and front coat facings right sides together, clip the shoulder seams in place, then sew them on the machine. Next, place the coat facing and lining pieces right sides together and clip in place. Sew from one end of the first front facing across the back facing to the other end of the second front facing. Use scissors to clip into the curve of the back facing to allow the fabric to move more easily. Your coat lining is now complete. Take two of your outer coat pockets and mark a 5-inch opening in between the top and bottom seam allowance. I started my opening 1/2 inch below the top seam allowance. Next, place your outer coat pockets on the front main coat, right sides together, and clip in place. At the top of the 5-inch line, sew a perpendicular line until you reach your marking. Pivot and sew straight down your 5-inch line until you reach the end. Pivot again and sew another perpendicular line until you've reached the edge of the fabric. This is what your stitching should look like after it's complete. It's basically a half rectangle. Clip into the inside corners of that half rectangle that you just sewed at a 45-degree angle. Clip as close as possible to the stitching without clipping the stitching itself. Flip the pocket over to the wrong side of the front coat piece to reveal that half rectangle opening, then press it flat. This may take some finessing to get the clipped corners to lay properly. After everything has been pressed, place the remaining outer pocket pieces right sides together, then clip in place. Sew around the 3 sides of the outer pocket, leaving the opening side seam unstitched. Be sure to maneuver the main fabric out of the way to avoid accidentally attaching it to the outer pocket. Place the front and back coat pieces right sides together, clip the shoulder and side seams, then sew them in place. When you're sewing the side seams over the pocket opening, make sure to sew on the inside edge of the pocket opening. Otherwise, you'll end up sewing the pocket closed. You should be able to feel the edge with your finger. Once complete, press everything flat. This is what your completed outer coat pocket should look like. As you can see, this is our 5-inch opening that we marked and sewed around earlier. Moving on to the coat sleeves. Follow the same process to sew the coat sleeves as you did with the lining sleeves. Your outer coat is now complete. The last major step is to attach the lining and main coat pieces together. We start by attaching the lining and coat sleeves. To ensure we line these up correctly, temporarily place the lining inside the coat as how it would look as a finished product. Use a few clips to temporarily hold the wrist lining and coat pieces together. I suggest clipping at and around the sleeve side seam. Next, carefully pull the coat and lining sleeves apart to look like this. Paying close attention to how you previously clipped the wrists together, remove the clips and reattach them, but this time with the right sides of the coat and lining fabrics together. Do this for the full wrist circumference of both sleeves. Once complete, it should look like this. Sew around the perimeter of the wrists on both sleeves. When done, turn the sleeves right sides out, and you should have about 1 inch of main fabric folded under the inside of the sleeve. Next, we need to attach the facing to the lining. With your coat in this position, basically how it would look as a finished product, lift up the bottom of the lining and flip it over the top. Clip the lining and facing pieces right sides together. When you get to the bottom side seams, you should have an excess 2 inches of main fabric. To clip this properly, temporarily clip a portion of the bottom seams together. Then, make a fold in the side seams such that everything lines up together and you see that excess 1 inch of main fabric extend under the inside of the coat. Remove those temporary clips and finish clipping the side seams. Sew from one end of the front facing across the back facing to the other end of the front facing. Once complete, clip into the curve of the neckline to allow the fabric to move more easily. Then, turn the coat right sides out, and after pressing the lining and facing flat in this proper position, this is what the finished inner coat should look like. Now we need to attach the lining bottom to the coat bottom. With your coat in this position, basically how it would look as a finished product, lift up the bottom of the lining and flip it over the top. We need to match the right side of the lining with the right side of the coat such that it contains the coat body on the inside like a bag. Match the side seams and ends of the lining and coat, then clip in place. Make sure to leave about a 5-inch opening for turning the coat right side out. When you get to the ends of the bottom pieces, you will need to unstitch the side seam that was previously sewn to be able to properly attach the bottom pieces. You should be able to easily attach the bottom pieces at each end after you've done the seam ripping. So from one end of the bottom to the other end, making sure to leave the 5-inch opening unstitched. Since we unstitch a portion of the side seams, you will want to re-sew that back together by placing a few stitches along the bottom side of both ends of the coat. Once complete, turn the coat right side out through the opening. Fold in the seam allowances of the opening and press those flat along with the rest of the coat bottom. You should have about 1 inch of main fabric folded under on the inside of the coat. We will need to use a hand-sewn invisible ladder stitch to close up the opening at the bottom. To start the hand sewing, loop the needle through the lining fold line. Take the needle and place it directly opposite to that thread line into the fold line of the coat fabric. Then, have the needle exit a short distance down that fold line, approximately 1/8 of an inch. Next, place that needle directly opposite to that thread line into the fold line of the lining fabric. Then, have the needle exit a short distance down that fold line, approximately 1/8 of an inch. Repeat this process for the entire opening until it's closed. When you get to the end of the opening, make a few loops around the inside seam before pushing the needle through the inside of the seam to the outside of the coat. Cut the thread and it should be hidden on the inside of your coat. This is what everything should look like once complete. As you can see, your stitching is completely hidden. Top stitch around the outer perimeter of the coat, along the bottom, sides, and neckline to hold everything in place. Mark the location of your buttonholes and buttons on your front facing. I chose to use one 1.25-inch button placed at the waistline and 1 inch from the outside edge and hidden on the back side of the front facing. The corresponding buttonhole will be located 2 inches from the outside edge, also on the waistline to match up. We will sew the buttonhole first. If you don't have a buttonhole foot or your buttons are greater than 1 inch like mine, you can sew the buttonhole manually on your machine. Use a fabric marker or chalk to mark the buttonhole outline on your facing. The height of the buttonhole should extend 1/16 of an inch above and below the actual button height. The width of the buttonhole should extend 1/32 of an inch to the right and left of the buttonhole centerline. On your sewing machine, sew a straight stitch around the perimeter of the buttonhole opening. Next, change to a zigzag stitch length 0.3 width 2.0 and sew the two sides of the buttonhole. Change to a zigzag stitch length of 0.1 width 6.0 and sew a few stitches at the bottom and top. It's basically a bar tack. Take a seam ripper or small pair of scissors to cut into the center of the hole. Be sure to cut away loose threads. Your sewn buttonhole should look like this. Now we will hand sew the button. Take your thread and fold it in half. Feed the two ends through the needle eye. Place the needle through the center of the button location from the right side, but stop before the end loop disappears. Poke the needle back through the center of the button location and place it through the loop to tie a knot. Fold the fabric horizontally along that buttonhole mark. Take your button and align the center line along that fold. Take your needle and feed it through a thread or two of the fabric before putting it through the buttonhole. Bring it back through the other buttonhole while piercing a thread or two of the fabric. Repeat this process 3 to 5 times until it feels sturdy. Flatten the fabric and wrap the thread below the button around a few times. On the last wrap around, pull the needle through the loop to create a knot. This is what your completed hand sew button should look like. If you have multiple belt pieces, attach them together at the side seams. Then take your single and continuous belt and fold it lengthwise, placing right sides together. Clip in place. Remember to leave a 5-inch opening in the middle to turn it right sides out later. Sew from one end of the belt to the opening and then from the opening to the other end of the belt at a small seam allowance. I used 1/4 inch. Once complete, trim the corners of the belt. Then turn the belt right sides out. Push out the corners using a pointed edged object. Top stitch around the perimeter of the belt to hold things in place. The last step is to hand sew a chain threaded belt loop at the waistline on both sides of the coat. You will need 4 layers of thread to create the belt loop. Take your needle and feed it through a thread or two at the seam before looping it through itself to create a knot at the base. Now you're ready to start creating the chain. With your other hand, create a loop and feed the thread on the needle side through it. Maneuver the base of that loop as close as possible to the seam, marking the start of the belt loop. Make another loop with the thread and feed the thread on the needle side through it. Continue this process until you have your desired length. Then, tie a knot to secure the end and feed the needle through a thread or two at the seam before looping it through itself to create a knot. You want a little bit of ease in the belt loop. Repeat this process for the other belt loop. This is what your finished chain threaded belt loop should look like. And that was the last step. Your denim coat is now complete. This denim coat is fun and practical. It also can be worn multiple ways, with the coat done up, one lapel showing, and a belt. With the coat done up and no belt, and with the coat fully open. The coat has 6 pockets, 2 on the outside, and 4 hidden ones on the inside, big enough for your phone, passport, and wallet. It's perfect for the spring and early fall. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you make your own denim coat, please tag me. I'd love to see how it turned out. Happy sewing!